Well, hello everyone. I appreciate everyone being here. Today we're going to be talking about TotalMix FX and taking an in-depth look at how powerful this interface is for every one of RME's audio interfaces. So the first thing I'd like to do is show you the interface. Today we're using a Babyface Pro, and we're also going to be using a Fireface UFX Plus. So showing you a picture of the Babyface Pro I/O, we are going to see that TotalMix represents these inputs and outputs on the front and the side. And also when we look at the Fireface UFX Plus, because it has far more ins and outs, not only the 4 mic line inputs on the front and more headphone outs, but it also has MADI, which gives you an additional 94 inputs and outputs. And the reason I mention this is that when you switch between the interfaces, the number of I/Os that you have actually make up what you see. So since the Fireface has a lot more ins and outs, you're going to see more faders. And since the Babyface Pro has less ins and outs, it's going to be a simpler interface. So let's start with the fact that we have 3 rows. Okay, we have a master section and 3 rows. The top row is our hardware inputs. The middle row is our software playback channels. This is going to allow us to play not only one application, but we can use many applications since RME is a multi-client interface driver. So we can actually have several DAWs all play into this middle row. This is also where your Windows or Mac OS sounds will come in. And the bottom row is hardware outputs. And my headphone and my main out is right here. So the first thing I want to start with is getting around on the interface. So you can see that my microphone is an analog 1 input right here. So on the Babyface Pro, that represents this input right here. And if I had plugged in a microphone here, it would show up on analog input 2, instrument 3 and 4 right here, and so forth. And then the physical outputs, analog 1 and 2, phones 3 and 4, and then my digital I/O. So that's going to be analog 1 and 2 out, phones 3 and 4. And since the Babyface Pro actually has A.dot light pipe and SPDIF optical, that's represented here. First thing we're going to do is set up our control room section. This is a very important task. Now, for many people who first get the interface, this is how it's going to look. You're going to see analog 1 and 2 out, phones 3 and 4 out on the bottom row. So the first thing we always recommend that you do is assign the main out and assign the phones. And what this is going to do is it's going to do 2 things. One, it's going to organize your layout, very similar to a console. For many of us, we're used to having those faders over on the right. And number 2, it's going to affect where the talkback features go and where all of these control room controls are going to affect. Typically, the better way to think of it is, what output am I going to use? What physical output am I going to use for my studio monitors? I'm going to assign that to my main out. I want to use analog 1 and 2. And that brings analog 1 and 2 over from here over to here. And it's going to make all of these control room features like dim and recall and mono, talkback, function right here. The second question you want to ask is, what outputs, physical outputs, am I going to use for my headphone jacks? So on the Babyface, phones 1 would typically be the phones output. So that's phones 3 and 4, which is right here. So once you've set up your control room, every time you hit talkback, whatever you're using for your talkback mic is going to go to the phones. And you can set up your talkback mic to be another mic input. And the way you do that is you go to Options, Settings. What input is my talkback? It's going to be analog 2, analog input 2. And what do I want my dim setting to be when I hit the dim button, either on the Babyface or an ARC USB, for example? So that act right there turns analog input 2 into my talkback. All right. Over here in your blue area, this has a names button, and you can toggle between the default names and any custom names. So that's why you're seeing this highlighted and going back and forth as I set up my talkback. So now every time I hit talkback, mic input 2 is my talkback mic, and it's going to feed to my headphones. So that's what's going on there. So we're going to go ahead and put that back to none. And let's just do some basic routing. So typically, we'd plug in our microphone, and every input fader and every playback fader and every output fader have a settings icon, which looks like a little wrench. You click on that, and that is where you can set your gain. You can also type it in. So if it's kind of like a digital gain control. So if you want to set it, you can literally set it to be as very precise in half dB steps. This is where we have phantom power and pad. Since this is a dynamic mic, I just wanted to set the gain to a level that I'm pretty happy with, and I can see my meter. Now, how do I listen to this in the phones, and how do I listen to this in the main out? And this, what I'm about to explain to you, is consistent for every audio interface manufactured by RME. The basic idea is you click on an output or you set an output. You can either click on an output down here, or under any fader, you can choose the output that's selected. So if I wanted to choose phones, I do that, and that's the same as clicking on phones. If I wanted to choose analog 1 and 2 out, I can do it that way, and that's the same as clicking on it down here. So if you watch underneath the faders, and as I click, it changes. Now everything I'm doing is in this submix routing mode. There's also a free mode, which allows me to select multiple things simultaneously. So I could select analog 1 and 2 as the output, and this fader is now changing the level. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. Let's just stay with submix mode. So what I want you to walk away with today is that if I'm in submix mode, which is a mode I highly recommend for beginners, click on an output, bring up the fader, and bring up your master, and click on this output and bring up the fader. So if I had somebody connected to channel 2 and I wanted to hear them in the phones, I'd click on phones and bring it up. And now this audio would be fed right to phones. Now I'm going to play some music on the software side, and we'll show that as well. All right. But what I want you to remember today is simply click on any output, bring up the fader, and now that's how you send the audio to that physical output. So everything we've done up to this point is just inputs to outputs, all right? You can also clear a mix by just right-clicking and do clear submix, and everything goes back to normal, all right? And I like to leave my outputs at unity, and that way if I wanted something to go to 8-at, 5 and 6, I can just bring it up and I immediately see it, all right? That's what you're seeing me do here. So that is playing and listening, that is listening to the audio input and then assigning it to an output. What if you wanted to listen to software? So on my Mac, I can go to my audio MIDI setup, and on a Windows machine, I would go to the sound control panel, and I've assigned the Babyface Pro to be my default playback device. That means all of my Mac sounds, alerts, of course, you have preferences. You can turn those alerts off. But all my Mac sounds, so if I go to Safari and go to YouTube, if I play PowerPoint and there's multimedia, any sounds, iTunes, for example, and the same is true with Windows, is now going to feed the Babyface Pro. And since the default is always 1 and 2, if you don't go to the configure speakers, that's where it'll be. And what that's going to mean for you is that any iTunes and Mac sounds are all going to show up on 1 and 2. So what I want to explain to you is that the software playback is a virtual mixer for your desktop audio. And it's channels 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6, 7 and 8, 9 and 10, 11 and 12. Now you might be a little confused because as I'm saying those numbers, you're not seeing that. You're seeing AN1, 2, phones 3, 4. That's because the default GUI names are the same as the inputs and outputs. And it does confuse people because it is the playback channels, but yet it says analog 1 and 2. So what I kind of recommend sometimes is people can customize this. So you could be playback 1 and 2, playback 3 and 4, playback 5 and 6, and so forth. Now in my software, I might see these channels as Babyface Pro 1, 2, Babyface Pro 3, 4, Babyface Pro 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, or I might see them as the original names as you see here. So let me show you that. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Reaper, which is a DAW, and I could go to any DAW, and I'm just going to go to a new project and check the preferences. Make sure I'm set to the Babyface Pro since that's the interface that I'm using. And what you're going to notice in the input matrix is that it's following the names of the faders the way the factory names. So analog 1, 2, 3, 4, SPDIF or A.12, A.3, 4. And of course, Reaper will show you if you want to do stereo pairs. If I want to assign the mixer to say 3 and 4, I can do that here. And if I had tracks, I could assign them to a specific mono fader. All right, so I'm going to assign Reaper to 3 and 4 in this example, which means it's going to show up right here. And that's because iTunes, which is a Windows sound, is going to show up in 1 and 2. So I'm going to just play iTunes and you'll see what I'm talking about. Now you'll notice I'm bringing the fader down, so it's changing what the level that you hear. I have the output 1 and 2 selected, and if I want to go back to the funky names of main and phones, I can do that, and I bring that up. If I want to bring it down in my phones, so I can have a different mix for phones and for main. And of course, I can also have a different mix for these outputs as well. So if I wanted to send them elsewhere, I could. Now notice when I hit mute, it mutes it for all outputs. So I got the music playing, but when I click on main, there's nothing. And when I click on phones, there's nothing, because while those are selected, the fader's down. If I wanted to send it to A.1 and 2 out, I can do that. And now it's going to A.1 and 2 out. If I want to send it to 3 and 4, but not as loud, I can do that. So it's a different mix. See, it's all the way up there. When I click there, it's halfway. Maybe here, I need it really loud. And here, maybe just a little bit. So I have literally independent mixes for every output. That's what we're trying to teach you. Now, another question I get a lot is, what if you have a mix in your phones and you want to copy that to another output? So, or better yet, let's say you have a really good mix on your studio monitors and the artist is like, yeah, I want that mix. Well, you can take the mix right here, and let me get some music going. It'll be kind of low. And I'm going to copy. Now I'm going to paste the submix from the main. And now both of these have the same mix. I'm going to clear that. Now another option is having a mix mirrored. That means, let's say the artist wants to hear whatever you're hearing on the studio monitors, and that means if you make changes, they're also hearing that too. So there is something called mirror. You can right-click, still copy it. So notice it says copy mirror. It's on the clipboard, but now I want to mirror, not paste. Paste just means it's going to paste whatever the mix was at that moment in time, but if I make any changes to that mix on the main mix side, then it's not going to matter. But if I mirror the output, it's going to tie them together, so I can't click on them separately. I also can't easily choose them separately, because it's like choosing the same thing. It doesn't matter which one I choose, because they're identical down here. So now everything I do is affecting the main out as well as the phones out. I mean, I could mirror everything. I could make every output have the exact same mix by just doing mirror output main, mirror output main. So it allows me to essentially, no matter what I do, every output is the same thing. Now I can control the master outputs independently, but the mix is the same. And of course, if I want to clear that, remove, 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 remove. And now everything's independent again. Okay. So this is really powerful for a lot of scenarios in the studio. And it just depends on, what you're doing and how you want to do it. But I do get a lot of questions about copying mixes and mirroring mixes. So right now we have my microphone coming in input 1, and it's going out to main, and it's going out to phones. Now let's talk about this section, and then we're going to do some DAW work. We're going to talk about, interviewing Skype calls, and then we're going to go to the Fireface UFX Plus and talk about some other things. So the first thing I want you to notice in the master section is we have the ability to turn the mutes and the solos on and off very easily if we have things muted, for example. The view option, we've talked about submix and free. Submix has been this idea of always clicking on an output or selecting an output, and it's the whole interface, that the mix of the whole interface is going to that output. So you're doing one mix at a time. With free, you can choose several mixes simultaneously. So if you want to set that any changes I make to this fader, I want to be for the phones, but any change I make on this input, I want it to be the mix for the mains. And any change on this fader, I want it to be the mix for the mains, the mains, the mains. But maybe on ADAT 5 and 6, I want that to be going right out 5 and 6, or maybe 7 and 8. And then anything I do on 7 and 8, I want to be for the phone. So I'm selecting different outputs. So now everything I do here goes to the phones. Everything I do here is going to analog 1 and 2. So it's like being able to click on multiple outputs at the same time, but they correspond to only certain things. Same with the playback. If I want this playback change to only be going to phones 3 and 4, it's just me, but it's not affecting anybody else. Free can get very complicated, but it's also very powerful once you get very flexible and comfortable with the interface. So the routing mode just gives you flexibility to do lots of things at once, where submix is more of a click once, make changes, click again, that kind of thing. All right. In the meters, we can do post effects meters and RMS. We can show effects because we have built-in effects. You can also click here, and then we can hit the trim and see where the different trim settings are on all the faders. If there's multiple mixes on a fader too. Also, there's a 2-row feature. If you don't like the 3-row interface and you want to move the middle row up here, and think of the middle row, which is software playback. Technically, it's a source. Also, inputs are a source. So some people like the idea of having their middle row to be able to go wherever it needs to go. So if I do a 2-row interface, now I have my hardware inputs and my software playback on the top row, and then my hardware outputs on the middle row. Well, it's the bottom row now. I prefer the 3-row so I can keep it separate in my mind. Inputs, software, outputs. It just works for me. Now we have snapshots, so we can store snapshots to do certain things, and I can recall snapshots very easily. And of course, when I did that, it put that mix back up. And you can store snapshots by just hitting store and doing that. Now we have groups. We can do fader groups, mute groups, and things like that. So I could basically, if I wanted to move a bunch of faders at once or control the outputs at once, if I was doing a surround sound mix, so maybe I could create mono these outputs like this, and I wanted to group these outputs together, I can basically go edit, and I want to go fader and just click the faders. And now I can move them all together. And if I wanted to change the relative mixes of them, I can just uncheck it, change what I want to do, and then when I recheck it, everything stays relative. And you can do that with inputs and outputs. You also can do that with solos by hitting that and then selecting what you want to solo and make that a solo group. So you want to solo things at once. A lot of times you would do that more for input. So let's say I'm listening to these two microphones and I wanted to make that a solo group. I can do edit and then choose solo and hit edit again. Now it's solid. And now I can quickly do that. All right. And then mute groups work the exact same way. Last but not least are layouts. Layouts are essentially the GUI. Now, one of the things that people often don't realize is that you can customize your GUI. Now, the Babyface is a fairly simple interface because there's not that many input faders and output faders, so it's pretty easy to look at it and not get overwhelmed. When I go to the Fireface UFX, which has tons and tons of inputs and outputs, I can look at all of those faders, but I can also streamline my interface for a session. So if I'm only doing a vocal session and I only want to look at the mic inputs, I can save a layout and store it. I can also hit the W key on my keyboard and save it here. Now a layout is just the GUI. It's not any mix settings, but the workspace, when I hit the W key, and I can also do save as up here, I can save a workspace, which includes the layout and the settings at this, sort of like layouts and snapshots all in one saving. So that's another advantage. So for example, in the Babyface, I might have a very streamlined or preferred way to look at things. So maybe this is my preferred, but this is a more basic layout. And then I can also make different views that I like. Now you might be wondering, well, how do you do that? Well, let's go to a default layout of this. Notice everything is monoed up because I did it earlier. And I might have a basic layout. So let me first put everything back into stereo. So I can stereo pair my faders because my outputs I'm usually doing in stereo. And let me go back to a preferred layout. Now, how do I hide faders I'm not using? Maybe I'm not using the ADAT inputs. No problem. I can go up to Options, Channel Layout, and I got an Inputs, Playback Channels, which are the middle row, and Outputs. So maybe on the inputs, I only want to look at the mic inputs. So I can select things or Shift Select and hide those. And on the playback channels, maybe I'm only using playback channel 1 and 2. So I'm going to hide the others. And on the outputs, I'm not using any digital outs, so I'm going to get rid of them. And now I have a very streamlined window. All right. And then I could store this as maybe a view I like. If I want to get back to the other view, no problem. And that's how that works. So the idea behind this, essentially, everyone, is that if you have a workflow for tracking versus mixing versus doing interviews over the internet and stuff like that, that is very powerful. Now, before I switch over to the Babyface or the Fireface, I want to show you some other things that are possible with this unit. So let me first quit or just turn off iTunes so I can unmute this. Let me bring up my DAW, and we already created a new session. And so here's what I want to do. So, and I'll put the window of my DAW inside the TotalMix window. Now, obviously, if I click on TotalMix, it's going to disappear. But I just want you to be able to see TotalMix while I'm also doing things here. Now, let's say I want to, and with the current situation going on in the spring of 2020, there's a lot of people wanting to do interviews and interview a guest over the internet, maybe use Skype or something like that. So how would I set up an interview where I record my microphone and also record software? So one of the really powerful things of TotalMix is the ability to manage desktop audio. Now, all you've seen me do in the software playback channel so far is just do playing back like iTunes, or if you're on Windows, maybe Windows Media Player. So what if I have a session? So I'll pull up a session here. Find something. There's a session, and I can use the matrix to send the audio into channels 3 and 4. There it is. Now I might want to bring in another piece of software while that's playing. Maybe an amp simulation program. The Babyface Pro currently is coming with S Gear, and now I can go into my amp simulation software and set the audio. The input for my amp is going to be input 3 on the Babyface, and I want the output of this to go to 5 and 6, which means it's going to show up right here. So then I might label this Reaper, or better yet, maybe I'll label it DAW, and I'll label this guitar amp. And then I still have this for my Mac OS software. So you can see I can use the middle row to mix and submix multiple software sources at the same time. That's one way to use it. And maybe I want to send the DAW to my phones and my main. While I'm doing that, but I also only want to send the amp to the phones and not to the main. So see how powerful that can be. All right. I also can stem tracks within a DAW into multiple areas in the middle row. And the reason I might want to stem individual tracks like guitar and bass and something into these individual channels and mix it here is because I want to create different submixes for folks on headphones. So RME and TotalMix have a very powerful way because you can create all these different mixes. So let me go back to Reaper. Open up a different session that has multi-track. And right here, I'm sending one set of tracks to 1 and 2, another set of tracks to 3 and 4, another set of tracks to 5 and 6, and another set of tracks to 7 and 8, which are these channels here. I also, if it was a mono track, I could do it right in here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and play that. Now I got 4 different things going on at once. So what I want to do is only work with one at a time. All right. So that's controlling my headphone mix, and this is controlling the mix you all hear. Now maybe I want to also do these all together. So now I'm hearing all those tracks at once. So it can get very powerful if this were kick, drum, snare, da-da-da-da-da, and then I can create all these separate mixes, and you saw me mirror it. So I was doing several things at once just to show you the power of this program. All right, let's go back to Reaper. And let's do a new project. And now let's talk about what I wanted to show you. Let's say, for example, we wanted to record my voice that's coming in input 1 and 2. Well, input 1. And I wanted to record somebody on Skype. Now, Skype is software. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to bring all these faders down, or zero them, how you want to think of it. And I'm going to call this Skype, or my guest. And if I open up Skype on my computer, I can choose the Babyface Pro as an input. So I literally go to Skype. audio video. I'm not really using video. I have a webcam on my ARC USB, but you can ignore that. My Babyface Pro is set as an input, and the Babyface Pro is set as an output. And that means the person speaking to me over Skype, their audio is going to show up right here, because there's no choice in Skype for Babyface Pro channel 1, 2, 3, and 4. It's just Babyface Pro. It's a limit of the operating system. So it's going to send the Skype audio right here. Now let's pretend we've made a call on Skype. And what I'm going to do to simulate that call is I'm just going to play some music in the background, because this is also OS operating system. So we're going to pretend that is my guest. All right. So I got me talking and my guest talking right here. And what I can do is create a mix for this. So right now, main out is the mix, and I'm doing loop back, which means the main out is set to input 1 and 2. And loop back basically turns an output into its corresponding input. Now remember, I set the main out to be 1 and 2. So as soon as I hit loop back, that says, okay, take the output 1 and 2 and make it look like the input 1 and 2. So that means this mix is what Skype is seeing, because I selected Babyface Pro. When I select Babyface Pro, it's input 1 and 2. When I select Babyface Pro as the output, it's output 1 and 2, which means it's right here. So by doing loopback, whatever I mix here is what the person on Skype is going to hear. And notice I don't have their audio up. So this is the mix minus going back to Skype. Now I want to record my microphone on track 1, and I want to interview my guest on track 2. So what I need to do is create a mix of my guest, because this is software. This is not a physical input. And the DAW will only see a physical input. So I can take one of the available outputs that I'm not using. So I'll just say 7 and 8, bring up the music, which again is my guest. We're using the music in the background to simulate audio for my guest. So this is my guest. Or this is going to go to, we'll just call it guest, which is essentially just a mix of the Skype right here. And I'm going to use loopback and make 7 and 8. Yeah, it's probably guest. Probably better if I speak. So I'm going to make loopback 8 at 7 and 8, input 8 at 7 and 8. And then when I go to my software, I'm going to insert some tracks. So I'm going to record myself, input, mic 1, there I am, and then I want to record my guest right here, input, 7 and 8, I mean technically it's mono, so I could do 7 if I wanted to, and there's my guest. And this is how I would record both people at the same time. So I have me here and I have my guest here, and they're on separate tracks. So again, this goes back to the power of TotalMix and its ability to manage your desktop audio and record it as separate inputs, and do things like Skype interviews and separate audio. Trying to do this with other audio interfaces can be quite challenging. This is all part of the TotalMix infrastructure. And what's nice about it is I could save this entire setup here as a Skype setup and always get back to it very, very quickly. So I could just hit the W key, or I can do save as, save workspace as, Skype interview. And there it is. And then if I want to load that back in, so let's say I go back to my other setup, I could literally just do load workspace and choose my Skype setup, and now everything will go back to this. So this is so powerful, all right? What I'd like to do next is switch over to the Fireface UFX Plus to show you the main difference between TotalMix on the Fireface series and TotalMix on the Babyface. Now, everything I've done has been mixing and submixing and routing, but I haven't done anything with EQ or with effects. Now, it's important to note, and maybe just for purposes of keeping my interface clean, I'm just going to quit iTunes. All right. And I'm also going to quit Reaper. I haven't really showed you what effects can do. So you have one aux send and return right here. You also can see it right here as a numeric value. Now it's sending my microphone to the reverb and echo. And I can choose both or one or the other. Now you also want to do an effects return. So if I want you to hear it, it's right here, effects return on the output side. And again, I want to hear what you hear, so I'm going to copy mirror output. That way, whatever I do, you do. Test. And we're going to turn it on. Test 1, 2. Now it's kind of a short. Let's do a nice pre-delay. And let's change. Test 1, 2. And let's do a medium room. Test 1, 2. We also have echo. Test 1, 2. So this is primarily here. It's all DSP taking place on the FPGA chip. And this is great for creating headphone mixes without actually using any dealing with any latency or using any processing power on the computer. So if a vocalist during a recording session or a guitar player, like an acoustic player, wants quick reverb, this is a great way to do it. Now, so your effects send is right here. That's going to affect how much level it gets, and you're not going to see your effects out until you turn something on. Now we hear it. We can mute effects. That's another advantage of being in the control section. You can quickly mute effects, but still leave effects going on for the headphone mix, which is what I'm hearing through my monitors, because I have my monitors connected to my phones out, and I have the main out looping back to all of you. So that's using reverb. In addition to reverb and delay, which are a bus effects, or think of it as an aux send and return, we also have EQ on every input and output. So I can actually create different EQ settings, use the presets if I want to get in the ballpark, and I can save presets. So if I want a really nice live vocal mic, that just changed my EQ. There's even some crazy things that, for example, if I wanted to sound like a telephone, test 1, 2, I can do all kinds of stuff. Now, you might be wondering, what if I want to record that? Well, anytime you get the RME TotalMix going, you also have a driver. Looks like this. Now, if you're using a Thunderbolt, it's going to look like that. And if I open that up, and that'll always be in the task tray when it's active, and then I can do that. And now the EQ will be recorded. And if I was using the Fireface UFX Plus, it would be EQ and dynamic. So that's going to be my little segue into the Fireface. So right now we have EQ on every input with the Babyface and EQ on every output. And we can EQ the output, or we can EQ a specific input. When we EQ an input, that EQs the audio before it goes anywhere else. All right. And that's important to know. And a lot of people ask me about, when I'm recording, what do I have to do to get the DAW to see audio? All you got to do is as soon as you bring up the gain, if it's a mic channel, it goes right from there directly to the DAW. Everything else we're doing in TotalMix is for what you want to hear. I want to hear it in the main, so bring it up. I want to hear it in the phone, so bring it up. The trim setting and the EQ are a global setting no matter which output is selected. All right, so what I want to do now is we're going to switch over to the Fireface UFX Plus. Notice I have two interfaces connected at the same time in my computer, which is perfectly fine. And I've already created a setup for doing vocals. So I'm using the UFX Plus in this mock recording session. And on the front panel of the UFX Plus, we have 4 mic inputs, which happen to be input 9, 10, 11, and 12, because 1 through 8 are on the back, right here, sorry. So when we are looking at, here, let me just clean up my desktop a little bit. So when we are looking at this window, these are the inputs. I'm using, actually, let's get rid of, so we have vocal 1, 2, 3, and 4. You'll notice we have the EQ, we have the normal settings here, settings panel, and then we have EQ and dynamics. So the one addition on the Fireface series and the MADIface XT from RME, as well as the MADI FX card, is you have dynamics. So you still have the reverb and the delay, but you also have dynamics on every input and dynamics on every output. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a session, and I'm sort of simulating a live vocal session. And what we're going to do, I have the Doobie Brothers, so I'm going to bring up that session. And I've stemmed all the tracks into TotalMix just to simulate a vocal session, all right? So I'm going to just make sure I have the Fireface set up correctly. And these are all the IOs. So what I'm essentially doing, everyone, is I have the actual vocals of the Doobie Brothers from years ago. They're separate on each track. And I'm just going out of the unit and back in on some ADAT channels. And I'm just using the ADAT channels to illustrate how a mic session would work. So I'm just going to go ahead and play this.
Down around the corner, a half a mile from here, you see them old trains running, and you watch them disappear without love. Where would you be now? Without love.
So I got the vocal, lead vocal, and I have the backup vocals. All the rhythm tracks are here.
Family, and she won't be coming back without love. Where would you be right now?
And you can see I'm using the dynamics as a gate.
Without love. Down around the corner, a half a mile from here, you see them old trains running, and you watch them disappear without love. Where would you be now? Without love.
I have a version with all my effects set up as a snapshot.
You know I saw Miss Lucy down along the tracks. She lost her home and her family, and she won't be coming back without love. Where would you be right now? Without love. Down around the corner, a half a mile from here, you see them old trains running, and you watch them disappear without love. Where would you be now? Without love.
So basically what I'm showing you is just when you add the dynamics, you get a lot more flexibility on tracking and recording. Now, I'm using the Thunderbolt IO on the Fireface UFX Plus, so I go into my Thunderbolt control panel, and one of the things you're going to see is record EQ and dynamics. That means everything I'm doing in dynamics and EQ are being recorded. That means it's not being recorded, but it's also just for monitoring purposes. So hopefully you can see the primary difference between the TotalMix software on the Fireface models and Matiface XT versus going back to the Babyface. And I hope this session has been helpful in understanding what you can do. If you have questions, feel free to send me an email. My email is Derek, DEREK, @synthax.com. That's S as in Sally, Y as in yellow, N as in Nancy, THAX.com, Derek@synthax.com. And I'd be happy to address any questions you might have offline. If you have any questions or anything you need me to answer, I would be happy to. You can just go ahead and chat those, and we'll get those addressed with a live person. All right, thank you for watching, and have a wonderful day.